Rio trembled as the howling wind ripped through the towering trees, bending their ancient trunks under the sheer force of the storm. Rain poured in heavy sheets, turning the forest floor into a thick, treacherous mire. The young cub had never been so afraid. He had been running, trying to keep up with his mother, Ember, but in the chaos, she had disappeared into the swirling darkness. Now, Rio was alone. Every sound, the snapping of a branch, the distant rumble of thunder, sent a fresh wave of fear through his small frame. His heart pounded as he stumbled forward, desperate to find shelter, desperate to find her. The rain blurred his vision, and his little paws slipped in the mud as he pushed through the dense underbrush. His breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He didn't know how long he had been wandering when he realized he had strayed into unfamiliar territory. The trees here were darker, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the storm-lit sky. The air carried a different scent, musky and sharp, laced with something Rio couldn't quite place but instinctively feared. He hesitated, his ears flicking as he picked up a low, guttural growl, then another, and another. Shadows moved through the undergrowth, sleek bodies slipping between the trees with silent, predatory grace. Yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, watching, waiting. Rio's breath hitched. He knew what they were. Wolves. The pack emerged slowly, their bodies forming a loose, shifting ring around him, cutting off any hope of escape. Their leader, a massive, silver-furred beast with a jagged scar across his muzzle, stepped forward. Shadow. The name was whispered in the forest, a specter of fangs and ruthless cunning. He studied Rio with cold, calculating eyes, his muscles coiled beneath his thick fur. Rio took a shaky step back. But the moment he moved, the wolves pressed in closer. They were playing with him, testing him, enjoying his fear. Rio's mind screamed for his mother. He tried to stand tall, to make himself look bigger. But he was just a cub, alone and small in the face of creatures born for the hunt. The circle tightened, a low snarl rippled through the pack, and Rio squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the end. Then came a sound that tore through the storm, deeper than the thunder, darker than the night itself, a roar, ancient and terrible. The ground trembled as something massive crashed through the underbrush. A shape, larger than any Rio had ever seen, emerged from the darkness, grim. His name was spoken in hushed tones among the forest's creatures, a legend as old as the trees. The grizzled bear was a behemoth of muscle and scars, his fur streaked with silver and marred by the battles of a life hard fought. His eyes, deep and knowing, burned with a fury that turned the air electric. The wolves hesitated, their hunger momentarily tempered by instinctive caution. But Shadow did not back down. He bared his fangs, his growl a challenge that rumbled through the clearing. Grim did not flinch. He moved forward with slow, deliberate power, his massive paws sinking into the mud, his presence alone pushing the wolves back a step. Then, with a sudden explosion of movement, he struck. Rio had never seen such raw force. Grim moved like a storm-given flesh, his massive paw swiping through the air with bone-crushing strength. A wolf yelped as it was sent sprawling, its ribs cracking under the impact. Another lunged for Grim's throat, but the old bear twisted, catching it midair and slamming it into the ground with terrifying ease. The wolves attacked in unison, a flurry of fangs and claws. But Grim was relentless. His roar drowned out the storm, a sound so primal that even the wind seemed to falter. Shadow darted in, faster than the others, his jaws snapping just shy of Grim's flank. The old bear turned, his teeth bared in a snarl of his own. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He lunged. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground, rolling through the mud in a tangle of fur and fury. Shadow clawed at Grim's face, his teeth aiming for the bear's throat. But Grim reared up, shaking the wolf off and slamming him down with a force that left the earth quivering. For a moment, silence. The pack froze, their eyes locked on their fallen leader. Shadow lay still, his sides heaving, his body beaten and bloodied. Grim stood over him, breathing hard, his own fur streaked with wounds. But his strength was unbroken. His message was clear. One by one, the wolves backed away, their snarls fading into wary submission. They knew when they had lost. With a final glance at Shadow, they melted into the trees, their eyes lingering on the old bear before vanishing into the night. Rio could barely breathe. He looked up at Grim, the bear's massive form towering over him. For a moment, he feared this savior as much as he had feared the wolves. But then Grim lowered his head, his deep-set eyes meeting Rio's. There was something in him, something ancient, something patient. He did not speak, but Rio understood. The storm raged on, but the night no longer felt so terrifying. Grim turned, his steps slow and steady, his body weary but unyielding. He did not have to look back to know that Rio was following. And so they walked, the old bear and the lost cub, through the rain and the darkness, through the forest that had nearly devoured one and barely scarred the other. The storm would pass, and Rio was no longer alone. The storm had passed, leaving the forest drenched in the silver light of morning. Puddles glistened between the roots of towering trees, and the air was thick with the fresh scent of wet earth. Birds sang cautiously, testing the quiet, as if uncertain whether the chaos of the night had truly ended. Grim moved through the undergrowth with the steady, deliberate gait of something ancient and unshaken. He did not glance back at the small, muddy figure trailing behind him. Rio, though exhausted, refused to stop. He stumbled over twisted roots, slipped on the damp ground, but pressed forward with stubborn determination. His paws ached, his belly growled with hunger, but he had already lost everything. His mother, his home. He had nothing left except the bear who had saved him. Grim did not speak, not in the way Rio wanted him to. He did not offer comfort, nor reassurance, nor even a glance of acknowledgement. But he also did not chase Rio away. Not truly. He growled when the cub got too close, huffed in annoyance when Rio tripped too often. But his pace never quickened to leave him behind. So Rio followed, step after step, even when his legs trembled from exhaustion. By the time they reached the river, the sun hung high in the sky, its warmth cutting through the lingering chill of the storm. The water rushed over smooth stones, swirling in deep pools where fish darted like flashes of silver. Grim stopped at the riverbank and finally turned to face the cub. His dark eyes, unreadable as the depths of the forest, studied Rio for a long moment before he spoke. "You want to stay?" His voice was rough, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Rio swallowed and nodded. "Then learn." Grim turned toward the river without another word. He stepped into the shallows, the current swirling around his legs, and stood still. For a moment, Rio thought he was simply drinking. But then, so fast that Rio barely saw it, Grim's massive paw lashed out. Water exploded into the air, and when it fell away, the bear stood with a wriggling fish clamped between his jaws. Without ceremony, he crushed it between his teeth, swallowed, and then stepped back onto the shore. "That is how you eat," Grim said. "If you cannot do this, you do not belong here." Rio stared at the water. The fish moved quickly, their scales flashing like tiny blades of light. He hesitated, his stomach twisting in hunger. But when he looked back at Grim, the old bear was already settling onto his haunches, watching with the disinterest of a creature who had already decided the cub would fail. Rio's ears flattened. He would prove him wrong. Stepping into the river, he shivered as the cold water lapped at his fur. The current tugged at his small legs, and he had to plant his paws firmly to keep from slipping. He watched the fish, his heart pounding. Then, just as Grim had, he lunged. He missed. Water splashed wildly, drenching him as the fish darted away untouched. Rio stumbled, blinking away the droplets clinging to his face. Behind him, Grim snorted. Too slow. Rio growled under his breath and tried again. He watched more carefully this time, waiting until a fish swam near. His muscles tensed. He struck. Again. Nothing. The next hour passed in a cycle of failures. He lunged too soon, too late, too clumsily. His claws raked through empty water while fish scattered away. Untouched. The river felt colder with each failure, and his frustration grew with every splash. Grim remained where he was, silent except for the occasional gruff remark. "You're swinging blindly. Stop moving so much. You will starve before you catch one that way." Rio's fur bristled, but he bit back his frustration. He wouldn't let Grim chase him away. He would do this. He had to. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to stop lunging at every shadow. He steadied his stance, letting the river's rhythm seep into his bones. The fish moved in patterns, their movements not as chaotic as he had first thought. They swam in loops, darting between the rocks but always returning to the same paths. He focused, waited. Then, he struck. His claws found purchase. For a heartbeat, Rio felt the slick, wriggling body beneath his paw. And his heart leapt, but the fish slipped free, vanishing into the current before he could close his jaws around it. He let out a growl of frustration, ready to collapse onto the shore in defeat. But then, that was better. Grim rumbled. Rio's ears twitched. He turned, surprised. Grim's expression hadn't changed, but something in his tone had. The cub blinked, then turned back to the water. Better. He was getting better. He tried again, and again. The sun had begun its slow descent when Rio finally felt it, his claws sinking deep. The sudden weight of a thrashing body beneath him. He clamped his jaws down before it could escape, his teeth digging into cool, quivering flesh. The taste of fresh fish filled his mouth. Sharp and real. He had done it. Rio scrambled onto the shore, the fish still wriggling in his grip. His chest heaved, his legs ached, but none of that mattered. He had caught it. He had won. He looked up at Grim, expecting, what? Praise? A nod of approval? The old bear simply stared for a long moment before exhaling through his nose. "Eat," was all he said. Rio did. The fish was the best thing he had ever tasted. Not because of its flavor, but because it was his. He had earned it. As he swallowed the last bite, warmth spread through him, filling more than just his belly. He looked up at Grim again, this time not as a cub looking for rescue, but as something else. Grim didn't speak, but he turned toward the trees, walking away from the river. Rio followed. The days passed in a rhythm of relentless hardship, each morning bringing new trials and every night ending with sore muscles and aching wounds. The cub who had once stumbled through the forest, wide-eyed and fragile, was beginning to change. Rio no longer flinched at the cold bite of dawn, no longer hesitated before stepping into the river, no longer doubted that his place was here, in the heart of the wilderness, under the watchful and unyielding eye of Grim. The old bear was an unforgiving teacher. There was no warmth in his lessons, no encouragement beyond the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. He did not coddle Rio, did not shield him from failure. Instead, he let the cub falter and fall, watching with quiet patience to see whether he would rise again. And Rio always did. He had learned to stalk through the underbrush without breaking a single twig, to sense the shift in the wind before the rain came, to read the whispers of the forest in the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. He could find food where once he would have starved, could move through the trees as though he belonged. But there was still one lesson left to master, the lesson that would decide whether he was truly strong enough to survive. Combat. It began without warning. One moment, Rio was lapping at the cool water of the river. And the next, a shadow loomed over him. He turned just as Grim struck. The impact sent Rio tumbling backward, water splashing around him as he scrambled to his feet. His heart pounded in confusion. But Grim did not wait for him to gather his thoughts. The old bear advanced, slow and deliberate, his massive frame blocking out the light. "Defend yourself," he rumbled. Rio barely had time to react before the next blow came. He tried to dodge, but he was too slow, too clumsy. Grim's paw caught him across the shoulder, knocking him to the ground again. "Too weak," Grim said, his voice carrying no malice, only fact. Rio growled in frustration, pushing himself up. He braced himself as Grim stepped forward again. The older bear's movements fluid and precise. He was testing Rio, pushing him, waiting to see if the cub would break. Rio refused to break. He lunged, his small claws swiping toward Grim's chest. But the old bear sidestepped with effortless grace. Before Rio could recover, a powerful paw sent him rolling across the ground. He gritted his teeth, pain lancing through his side. But pain was nothing new. Failure was nothing new. Again, he charged, faster this time, aiming lower, but Grim was faster still. The old bear twisted, using Rio's momentum against him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Again, Rio dug his claws into the earth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was covered in dust and bruises, his body aching from the repeated blows. But still, he stood, still, he faced Grim. And again, the battle continued. Days turned to weeks. Each time Grim attacked, Rio learned something new. He learned to anticipate the shift in Grim's weight before he struck, to read the flicker of his muscles before he moved. He learned that strength alone was not enough. Speed, strategy, and patience were just as vital. At first, he had fought blindly, swinging wildly in the hope of landing a blow. Now, he waited, he watched, he studied Grim as he had once studied the river's currents, as he had once studied the flight of birds before a storm. And one evening, when the golden light of dusk painted the forest in fire, Rio finally struck true. Grim lunged, his massive paw sweeping toward Rio in a move that had sent him sprawling countless times before. But this time, Rio did not move back. He did not freeze. He ducked. The wind of Grim's strike ruffled his fur. But the blow did not land. For the first time, Rio was faster. For the first time, he saw the opening. He turned, his body moving with instinct and understanding, and lashed out. His claws met flesh. Not deeply, not enough to wound, but enough to make contact. Enough to prove that he had learned. Grim stepped back, the faintest hint of surprise flickering in his dark eyes. He glanced at the shallow scratch along his side, then at Rio, who stood with his chest heaving, his gaze locked on the old bear with a fire that had not been there before. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Rio waited. He wanted to hear the words he had never heard from Grim. Approval, acknowledgement, something. But the old bear merely grunted, turning away. "You are not ready," he said. The words stung more than any wound. Rio's claws dug into the earth. "I landed a hit," he said, his voice edged with defiance. Grim did not look back. One strike does not mean victory. Rio's body tensed. His chest burned with something unfamiliar, not just frustration, but something deeper, something heavier. He had fought, endured, pushed himself beyond his limits. And still, it was not enough. But as he watched Grim's retreating form, as the wind rustled through the trees and the scent of damp earth filled the air, something else settled in his bones. Determination. He had come too far to stop now. So Rio followed. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that came before a storm. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. the moon casting pale light through the skeletal branches of the trees. Rio lay curled near the base of an ancient oak, his breath steady, though sleep did not fully claim him. Across the clearing, Grim rested, his massive form a dark silhouette against the moonlit grass. Something felt wrong. Rio's ears twitched. A sound, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, whispered through the underbrush. A shift in the shadows. The soft press of paws against damp earth. His body tensed, his instincts, sharpened by months of survival and training, screamed a warning. They were not alone. Then the howls shattered the night. A chorus of voices rose from the darkness, surrounding them on all sides. Low growls rippled through the trees, a sound filled with malice and hunger. Rio shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs as he turned to Grim. The old bear was already rising, his eyes gleaming like embers beneath his heavy brow. He had known this would come. The wolves stepped into the light, their bodies sleek and predatory, their yellow eyes locked onto their prey. This was not the scattered, desperate pack Rio had faced before. They had returned stronger, in greater numbers, and leading them, his silver fur glowing beneath the moon, was Shadow. The great wolf moved with the slow, confident grace of a predator who knew he had already won. His scarred muzzle curled into a snarl as he met Grim's gaze. This time, he growled, "There will be no escape." Grim did not answer. He only shifted his weight, his muscles coiling beneath his thick fur. He had fought battles before, had faced death and walked away each time. He knew what must be done. Shadow's gaze flickered to Rio, and a cruel glint entered his eyes. "The cub," he said, "you should have let him die." Rio's fur bristled, but before he could speak, Shadow gave the command, "Kill them both." The clearing erupted into chaos. Wolves lunged from the shadows, their fangs flashing in the moonlight. Grim met them with a roar that shook the trees, his massive form a whirlwind of raw power. He struck with terrifying force, his claws tearing through fur and flesh, his jaws crushing bone. A wolf yelped as it was sent tumbling. Another crumpled beneath the weight of his blow. But for every wolf that fell, two more took its place. Rio barely had time to register the battle before Shadow was upon him. The silver wolf moved like a phantom, swift and deadly, his fangs snapping inches from Rio's throat. The cub dodged, instinct guiding his movements as he leapt back, his heart pounding. Shadow did not relent. He pressed forward, forcing Rio toward the trees. Away from Grim, away from any chance of help. Rio was alone. But he was not the same cub who had cowered before the pack all those moons ago. Shadow lunged, his fangs seeking Rio's throat. But this time, Rio was ready. He dropped low at the last second, feeling the rush of wind as Shadow sailed over him. The wolf landed, skidding in the dirt, his snarl twisting with frustration. Rio did not wait. He spun, his claws slashing toward Shadow's flank. But the wolf was fast. Too fast. He twisted away, his own claws raking across Rio's shoulder. Drawing blood. Pain flared, but Rio barely felt it. He had trained for this. He had suffered, endured, learned. He would not lose. Shadow struck again, but Rio moved with him now, reading his patterns, watching the shift in his weight. The old lessons played in his mind, Grim's gruff voice echoing through the chaos. Do not waste movement. Anticipate. Do not react. Use their strength against them. Rio feinted left, drawing Shadow in, then pivoted sharply. The wolf's momentum carried him forward. Just as Rio's claws struck true, a deep gash opened along Shadow's side. The great wolf let out a snarl of pain, staggering back. His golden eyes flared with rage and something else, something Rio had never thought he would see. Recognition. The cub was no longer prey. But Shadow was not done. He shook himself, ignoring the wound, and lunged once more. This time, Rio met him head-on. They collided in a tangle of fur and claws, snapping and rolling across the ground. Teeth clashed. Paws struck. The scent of blood thick in the air. Shadow had the advantage of size and experience. But Rio had something else. Endurance. The battles with Grim, the endless training, the failures and pain, they had made him stronger. He did not waver, did not back down. He fought with everything he had. Every lesson burned into his bones. And then he saw it, the opening. Shadow reared back for a final strike. But Rio moved first. He twisted, driving his claws deep into the wolf's already wounded side. Shadow let out a choked snarl. Staggering, his legs trembled beneath him, his breath ragged. And in that moment, the battle was lost. For him, across the clearing, Grim stood victorious, his fur matted with blood, but his stance unbroken. Around him, the surviving wolves hesitated, their eyes darting between their fallen leader and the monstrous bear who had once again defied them. Shadow snarled, baring his teeth, but he knew, he had underestimated them both. Retreat, he growled, his voice thick with fury. The pack hesitated, but when Shadow turned and limped into the darkness, they followed, one by one. The wolves vanished into the trees, their howls fading into the night. And then, silence. Rio stood in the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body aching with exhaustion. He turned to Grim, expecting something, acknowledgement, a nod, a word. The old bear met his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he grunted. It was not much, but it was enough. The wind carried the scent of blood and victory through the clearing. The wolves were gone, their howls fading into the depths of the forest, their leader limping into the darkness. The battle was over, but its echoes remained. The earth was scarred where claws had torn through it, the air still thick with the tension of survival. Rio stood amidst it all, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body aching from the struggle. The pain no longer frightened him. It was merely proof of what he had endured, of what he had become. He had faced Shadow, not as prey, not as a helpless cub, but as something more, and he had won. He lifted his gaze to Grim, searching for something in the old bear's face. A sign, a word, anything to mark this moment. Grim had always been unreadable, his approval never given freely, his lessons harsh but necessary. For so long, Rio had sought recognition in his eyes, a sign that he had proven himself. Now, as the old bear looked at him, something had changed. Grim did not see a burden anymore. He did not see a lost cub stumbling through the world, weak and afraid. He saw a survivor, a warrior. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was nothing to say. The silence between them was no longer the silence of distance, of cold indifference. It was the silence of understanding. Then Grim turned. Without a word, he walked away, his massive form disappearing into the trees, his steps slow but sure, as though he had always known this moment would come. He did not look back. And for the first time, Rio did not chase after him. He had spent so long following, learning, growing under the shadow of the old bear. But this was not Grim's path to walk. It never had been. This was his. Rio stood at the edge of the clearing, his body battered, his breath still heavy, but his heart steady. The forest stretched before him, dark and endless, the unknown waiting beyond the trees. But he was not afraid, because he was not that lost cub anymore. He had fought, he had endured, he had become something greater than he ever thought possible. But his journey was not over. There was one last thing he had to do. Find Ember. His mother's name had never faded from his heart. Even through the pain, the struggle, the battles, she was out there somewhere, lost in the vastness of the world, waiting. He did not know how far he would have to go, how many more trials lay ahead. But he would find her. Rio took one last look at the clearing, at the place where he had transformed, where he had been tested and tempered like fire through steel. Then he turned and walked into the trees, his steps strong, his heart burning with purpose. The forest stretched before him, endless and wild, and he walked toward it, fearless. The journey was just beginning.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.